Even Sonic gets sick sometimes. Prologue. Sonic cringed as a familiar buzzing sound snapped him out of his slumber. With a groan of dismay, he opened his eyes slightly, then poked his head out from the blankets he'd been sleeping under. It was 7 a.m, according to his alarm clock. His hand reached up to turn off the alarm, and the buzzing quickly came to a stop. "Just a little longer," Sonic muttered, putting his hand down as he lay his head upon his pillow. He closed his eyes again. As the hedgehog tried to go back to sleep, however, he felt an odd feeling in his throat, seemingly out of nowhere. He gave a few coughs, but it didn't help much. He turned over, wanting to get comfortable for just a few more minutes. But then Sonic felt a tickle in his nose, which trembled a bit. He gave a couple of sniffs, hoping they would relieve the tickle. But it didn't feel like any air was moving through his nostrils. He could feel the sensation getting worse anyway. "Ha? Ha?" Sonic inhaled, tilting his neck backward. He was going to sneeze. "Ah-choo!" Sonic doubled over as he released a loud sneeze, with some saliva being released from his mouth. Then he brought his forefinger up to rub his nose, as he often would after he'd sneezed. When Sonic opened his eyes, however, he saw that the light of the sun had filled his bedroom with brightness. Indeed, it was morning. Sonic slowly sat up in his bed, rubbing his eyes with one of his hands. Just as he'd finished doing that, however, another round of coughs escaped him, and he brought his fist up to cover his mouth. An audible groan escaped him as he sulked, a dull aching sensation coursing through his head as well as his throat. "Oh, feels so good." His nose began to itch again, and his eyelids lowered as his mouth fell open. Another sneeze was on the way. "Ah-ha-choo!" Sonic brought his upper body forwards as he sneezed again, but it was clear that his nose hadn't been satisfied. Almost as soon as he'd regained his breath, a second sneeze found its way out. "Achoo!" By the time he'd finished sneezing, a small amount of light green mucus had begun to ooze from his nose. With a loud sniffle, Sonic rubbed his nose again. But it wasn't long before he'd realized his nose was running. Maybe a quick blow into one of his tissues would be enough to fix this. He looked over at the end table next to his bed. There was his lamp, his alarm clock, his smartphone, but there weren't any boxes of tissues. Sonic sulked in dismay, then pressed his forefinger against one side of his nose. With a deep sniffle, he inhaled the drop of mucus back into his nasal passages. But then it found its way down into his throat, which kick-started another coughing attack. "Oh, no." Sonic groaned quietly as he regained his breath. He had a feeling he knew exactly what was wrong with him. He'd come down with a nasty cold. After a long moment of hesitation, the hedgehog pushed the blankets off him. Wearing only his gloves on his hands and a pair of white socks on his feet — he'd put the latter on the night before to keep his soles warm while he slept — he sat on the edge of the bed, then stepped off. His legs were a bit numb, as though they'd fallen asleep, and he could feel a couple of chills running down his back. But Sonic slowly trudged out of the bedroom, opening the door as he went. His hand went to rub his pounding head, but it felt slightly warm. Was he running a fever too? He had a feeling he might be, if he could feel it through his glove. A few groggy steps later, Sonic was in the bathroom, and no sooner than he'd gotten there did his nose begin to feel runny again. He pulled a tissue out from the box and held it to his nose, intending to blow. But before he could, another sneeze caught him off guard. The edges of the tissue Sonic was holding fluttered as he stifled a loud sneeze into it. It was quite painful, and the pressure that had been building prior to the release caused his head to ache even more. He then pulled the tissue away, looking a bit dazed. He rubbed his nose once with his forefinger, then finally blew into the tissue. It didn't clear his sinuses as much as he would have liked, but he didn't care. He balled up the used tissue, threw it into the trash can, and took out another tissue. As he wiped his nose, Sonic opened the medicine cabinet that was over the sink, snuffling occasionally as he looked inside. Once he'd found what he was looking for, a digital thermometer, he brought it out, switched it on with the push of a button, and tucked it underneath his tongue. For a minute the hedgehog stood where he was, rubbing and wiping a sore red nose as he waited for his temperature to be taken. Finally, the thermometer beeped, and he pulled it out to look at the reading. 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Definitely a fever. Aw, you gotta be kidding me, Sonic said to himself in dismay. He cleared his throat, then opened the medicine cabinet again to put the thermometer away. Just as he pushed it shut, however, his nose tickled again, and he sneezed once more into his tissue. Achoo! It was a little quieter than most of his other sneezes had been, but it was enough to make him lose his breath nonetheless. With a few congested sniffles, Sonic wiped his nose, moving his tissue here and there. When he was done rubbing his nose and disposing of his used tissue, he picked up an unopened box of tissues from beneath the sink. He brought that box with him out of the bathroom and into his bedroom. It would have taken him less time if he didn't feel so horrible. Once he was finally back in his room, he opened up the box of tissues and placed it on his end table. However, another chill then ran down Sonic's spine, and he couldn't help but shiver. He stepped back into his bed, wrapping himself in his warm, red and blue blankets as he did so. The next thing he knew, he wasn't feeling chilly anymore, but he could feel that familiar tickle returning to his stuffed-up nose, which began to move here and there rather noticeably. Sonic gave another audible sniffle as he rubbed his nose with the back of his hand. He was trying what he could, but he couldn't stave off that annoying itch. As a matter of fact, he could feel it getting worse. So he pulled his hand away as he lowered his eyelids. His chest heaved as his mouth fell open. Shoo! He then leaned over, looking almost depressed as his index finger automatically went to rub his nose. It was too bad no one was around to tell him bless you. Sonic reached over to his box of tissues, pulled one out, then held it to his nose as he blew, the edges of the tissue fluttering with a rush of air. He then blinked, emitting a few snuffles as he wiped his nose cutely. This brand of tissues he was using was Puffs, perfect for a sneezing, sniffling hedgehog like himself. That being said, his nose was still a bit stuffy, but it didn't surprise him. He just kept rubbing his poor nose. He had a feeling this day was going to be tough to get through.